Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. My name is Maggie Blay. I am one of the...
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Blay. I'm one of the counselors here. Welcome to our webinar, and I am very happy to introduce to you Chris Sheasley. He is going to be talking about workplace conflict. He's made conflict resolution his only profession and his central passion for over 24 years. He is among the most experienced and well-known conflict management consultants in the Northwest, and we are very, very happy to welcome him.
All right, thank you, Maggie.
Here you go.
Looking forward to talking with you all today about this cheerful subject of conflict in the workplace. I appreciate the opportunity to explore this with you all. As Maggie said, I'm a conflict resolution consultant. My specialty for the last 24 years has been dealing with conflicts in the workplace. Basically, I go into rooms full of angry people and help them talk to each other. So I've done about 1,700 cases in my career. In fact, here's a picture from one of my recent sessions. Give you a feel for some of my work. So on this topic today, in the hour that we have together, I'm going to explore 5 different concepts with you all, and I'd like to walk you through these. Also, I wanted to point out that in the webinar, you have access to a worksheet, a 5-page worksheet that's available for download as a PDF. So I encourage everybody listening to take a look at that document and have that in front of you as we go along, and I'll reference that as we work together here. So the 5 things we're going to do together. The first one is to develop an appreciation for the upside of conflict to help you kind of more constructively face the situations that you face in your work. And a lot of people have a negative perception of conflict, and because of that, we tend to avoid it and have trouble dealing with it in the workplace. So I want to help you all feel that there's another dimension to conflict, and we'll explore that first off after our introductions. The second point is to talk about the 3 pillars for effective conflict resolution. And this is a way of kind of a model, a very simplistic but easy model to remember and to have you have in mind as you work through the conflicts in your work life and with your colleagues. Third thing is to recognize how underlying needs are embedded in every conflict and how to use this insight to be successful in unlocking conflict. So folks, I'm going to give you the key to unlocking all human conflict by the time we're done here. So we'll give you some insights. And then fourthly, we're going to explore the key listening mindset. I think the one thing that if I could encourage all my clients to do, I would be out of a job basically if people were able to do this successfully. So I'm going to help you with kind of the one mindset that I think is the most critical one in my experience working with folks that are in deep conflicts with each other. And finally, give you a chance to explore how you can apply all of this to your work world. So that's the journey we're on together here. And I'd like to begin by giving you all an opportunity to reflect on your own experiences with conflict and your own kind of relationship to workplace conflict. So we have a series of 3 polling questions that we're going to pose to you all and ask you to take some consideration of and give us your best answers on these. So the first one is just to get a sense of your relationship to conflict in your organization. So the question is, how impacted is your organization by conflict? And you have a 4-point scale. Number 1 is you're very impacted. So basically the picture here is very reflective of what things look like in your organization. You know, people are tearing things apart and destroying the organization. Obviously not that extreme, but the sense of conflict having a high impact on your organization, all the way down to number 4, which is not impacted at all. So it's kind of constant Woodstock and nirvana in your workplace. So on that spectrum, where would you place your organization? And we'll give you about 20 seconds to respond to this poll. Starting off with kind of the big picture here, what the organization that you're embedded in is like, and then we'll drill down to your personal relationship with conflict. All right, the results are pouring in here, so we'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, so Joseph is going to share with you the results.
Yeah, so pretty much everyone's answered so far. About 57% said somewhat impacted. About 23% said less impacted, but 20% said very impacted.
Okay. So clearly it's kind of weighted towards the impacted end of the scale, which I think is typical of organizational life. If you have people, then you're probably occasionally are scorched by the heat of conflict, and it sounds like that's the case for most of you. So as I mentioned, I want to explore your personal relationship with conflict. So thinking about your relationship with this topic, you have a 5-point scale here. The first one is that you're very comfortable with conflict, and you're just like the guy in the picture here who's just relaxed and easy around conflict and can deal with it with no problem, all the way down to the 5th point, which is you'd rather have a root canal. So in terms of your relationship with conflict and how comfortable you are with it, I'd be curious to see what you all feel about this topic. Okay, here we go for your opportunity to vote. All right, and the results are just about fully tabulated here. And Joseph, results?
Yeah, it should be about pretty even split actually. 4% said very comfortable, 29% said somewhat comfortable, 32% said less comfortable, 31% said not comfortable, 4% said rather have a root canal. Pretty evenly split on those three for the most part, I'd say.
Okay, great. So my hope in working with you all on this topic today is to help you all kind of shift at least 1 point up the scale here, because it's typical in my work to find that most folks have some discomfort around conflict, and that's kind of reflected in a lot of the scoring that we see here. For those of you that are wherever you are on that scale, I'd like to, if we did this at the end of the presentation, my hope is that you kind of click up a point on the scale to the next level up. All right, then very last question is how effective you are on dealing with conflict situations. So again, thinking about the workplace and your interactions with your colleagues and your experience in workplace conflict situations, how effective are you in dealing with conflict around you? So can you get the fish out of the fishbowl, metaphorically speaking here? Right.
Results mostly in now. So probably the majority, 57% said somewhat effective, 23% said less effective, and 12% thought they were very effective, but 8% said not effective.
Okay. All right, great. So again, this is to help you kind of get your thinking going around this topic and your personal relationship and your success with conflict. And again, my hope is to help you all be more successful so you can get to the fish and get the resolution and fish it all the way into the boat. All right, so with that as our foundation, I want to begin with that first topic and outcome that I mentioned, which was trying to develop a different attitude towards conflict. So I'm going to ask you all to play a word game with me here. The next screen is going to have a word. It's going to pop up here in a moment. And I'd actually like you to take a pen and paper or your computer and get ready to type or get ready to write. And write down as many words as you can think of that come to mind when you think of this topic that's about to pop up on the screen here in a moment. So as you see the word, jot down all the words that come to mind. You'll have exactly 25 seconds to do it, and we'll give out prizes to whoever comes up with the most number of words. So we'll have to do it on the honor system in terms of telling us how many you came up with. So you can go now. Surprise, the word is conflict. How many words come to mind related to that concept? So jot down the first ones that come to mind. Just rapid fire, write them down, and I'll leave you alone here for about 15 seconds. All right, 5-second warning. And pens down. All right. So I'd be curious to hear the different words that you all came up with, but I think I can anticipate what some of them are. Did you have words on your list like fight, yelling, anger, war? I've done a similar exercise with many different groups, and that's typically the kinds of words that you see people developing. But I have a mission in my work, and that is to help people have this different attitude or more constructive attitude around conflict. And I think what's significant and important about that is to, if we do think of conflict and we think about things like fighting and yelling and war and argument and discord and all those negative connotations, then we really, I think, limit ourselves in our ability to deal with it effectively. So let's start shifting our perspective on this a little bit. Let's imagine that tomorrow we wake up and we look at the front page of our local paper or front page of our home page, and we see that the huge headline, "Peace breaks out." So imagine that there's world peace is broken out. Everybody is getting along with everybody. There's no more conflict, no more discord. Wouldn't that be great? Well, actually, think about it. If you have a world where there's no conflict, what are we missing? What have we actually done? So what I'm asking you all to do really is think about this idea that if there's no conflict, then what have we lost? And I'd like to suggest to you all that, in fact, in that world we've created of a no conflict world, we don't have differences, we don't have different points of view, and we don't have different perspectives. So what I like to think of as conflict instead is that it's actually a concept that can be constructive, that has positive attributes. And I think that when I asked you all to think about conflict and you wrote down all those words, what you were actually doing was writing down ways that you've seen conflict mismanaged rather than the concept of conflict itself. So if we start to shift our perspective here a little bit and start to think about the upside of conflict, then I think you can start to imagine that there's actually some positive benefits of conflict. I'm going to list those for you, and this is the first part of the handout, by the way, for those of you that are tracking in the handout. You'll see that there's a list with some options here to write down, and I'll give you those answers in a moment. But for me, conflict is like kind of the light on the dashboard of my car when I'm driving along, and there's this orange light, and it comes on, and it's indicating there's something going on here. There's something that needs attention. And conflict is like that in our relationships in the workplace and the people that we're interacting with. Kind of like a light that gives us a warning that something's amiss and something needs to be addressed. So with that in mind, I'd like to get you to start thinking about the positive parts of conflict. And the first one is just like that light on the dashboard, it raises awareness about a problem. So that's the first fill in the blank here in your materials. It increases awareness of the problem. So you can imagine as you think about your own conflicts in the workplace and the people that you've kind of bumped heads with, the conflict is really an indication that there's a concern, there's an issue, there's something that needs to be addressed. And so conflict plays that role and increases our awareness of the problem. So that's one positive upside of conflict. And the next one is its impact on our willingness to make changes. So again, if we had that world without conflict, then it's really not a world that's going to grow and where people are going to improve and where systems are going to improve. So conflict can be kind of a positive lubricant for change in organizational life and with each other. So it increases our incentives for change. On this one, how many people have had a relationship that's been destroyed because of conflict? I suspect all of you are thinking of at least one relationship in your life that conflict tore apart. But how often do we think about the inverse of that situation, that in fact we've all had relationships that are stronger because of conflict? People that have strong relationships are usually been through difficulties, and that's just true in the workplace as well. So we'll hope that this couple up here is one of the 50% marriages that make it. This is, though, a fact of conflict that we don't often focus our attention on, this idea that we actually can enhance and strengthen a relationship through the conflict and through working through the conflict. So again, it's not something that we naturally focus on, but it's built into a truism about conflict. And then I've kind of alluded to this idea too, but another benefit of conflict is that it increases our personal development. You know, everybody participating in the webinar today and working in the work world, and all the adults that are present here are better people because of the conflicts that you've been through and the experiences that you've had. You've learned to work through them and deal with conflict, and so it's actually contributed to your personal development. Even those of you that would rather have a root canal than deal with conflict, you have to deal with conflict in any case, so that can be an improvement for your personal development. And then the grand finale here, and this is not true for everybody, but for a lot of folks, conflict can be stimulating. And I think of cases I've had where people came in and had a lot of focus on the conflict and a lot of energy around it. So it can be stimulating generally or for individuals, but it can also be a stimulant for, again, for organizational life and kind of get people moving and interacting and dealing with each other and working through problems. So there's a couple more points I'd like to make on this, and then I'll make kind of a grand statement about conflict after we've looked at two more questions. So as you see this list, I'd like you to just think about your options here and try to select one. And again, we're doing this on the honor system, so you can jot down your own letter, and then I'll give you the answer. This also, again, in your work materials, workbook materials, so you can take a look at that. So conflict typically occurs within relationships that are dysfunctional, fragmented, intimate, dynamic, interdependent, emergent, uncertain, or working. So everybody contemplating that for a moment. Have your letter or your word in mind, and I'll give you the answer, which is interdependent. So what this means is anytime you look at a definition of conflict, it requires interdependence. Everybody you've ever been in conflict with in the workplace is somebody on whom you rely, somebody that has something that you need, an interaction, a relationship that you have with that other person, and that's a fact built into the conflict. I've always thought that's rather profound because we don't have conflict with people we don't know and don't work with and don't have a relationship with. We only have conflicts with the people that we actually have to interface with and from whom we need something. And if you think about all the conflicts or think about your nemesis at work or the people you really struggle with most, the truth is that's somebody that you have this kind of a relationship with, and that as a foundation for every conflict you'll ever be in from this point forward, I would hope would give you a slightly different perspective on that other person and that relationship that you're struggling with. In a similar vein, conflict also emerges from, and here your options are separation, apprehension, influence, interaction, vulnerability, power, or hostility. Again, I've already kind of hinted at the answer here, but it's really about the interaction. So everybody that you have conflict with, you interact with, and you are interdependent with. So the takeaway for me on all of this around conflict is that we all have discomfort around conflict. Nobody found very few people that are running and embracing their very next conflict, except for the 4% of you that said that you were very comfortable with conflict. But for most of us, it's kind of an uncomfortable, disquieting situation to find ourselves in. But what I'd like you to take away from this section is this idea that conflict ain't so bad. It doesn't have to be a negative a negative thing or something that you need to fear. It's really ultimately a natural, normal, and even healthy part of life. And if you can have that attitude, then you're more likely to approach the next conflict in a more constructive way. I find that most of my clients get into the conflicts that they find themselves in because they've allowed them to mature, and they've allowed the conflict to go on too long without addressing the situation out of fear, out of anxiety, out of apprehension around conflict, and they're not looking at the positive side of it, the upside of conflict, and what's possible through the conflict. So that's my encouragement to you all, is to develop that new attitude. All right, so how do you do this, and what are some tools that you can use to be more successful? So the second outcome for today was to look at the 3 pillars of effective conflict resolution to help you fully address the conflict and achieve better outcomes. So with that in mind, I'd like to give you a little sample case here, and I'll give you an example of a case that I actually managed, and then use the 3 pillars to describe it. I had 2 employees. One was named Hank, and the other was named Julie. Hank was working on his computer one day, and he was checking his emails, and he saw an email from Julie, and he was utterly incensed. He couldn't believe that she was sending an email on this topic that was very, very important to him. That she hadn't come to him directly was infuriating. And he got up and went down the hall and pounded on her door. She didn't answer. So he actually opened up her door, and there she was sitting with 2 of her employees having a little meeting. She looked up rather startled and was like, well, what's going on? What do you need? He said, I need to talk to you right now. I can't believe you just sent me that email. And against her better judgment, she went across the hall and started talking with him. And it did not go well. He was furious that she had withdrawn from a project that they've been working on for about 18 months. She said she couldn't participate anymore and was focusing her energies elsewhere. And for him, that was just very frustrating that she withdrew from the process by sending him an email rather than talking to him directly about it. So I give you that example case, and I want to use that as a foundation to describe the 3 dimensions of conflict. And these are also the 3 dimensions, or the 3 pillars, for resolving conflict. So the first one that you see here is the idea of a problem. In every conflict that you all have been thinking about, whatever brought you into this webinar, and the conflicts that you're dealing with in your work life, there's some tangible problem, there's some issue, there's something that you and the other person or persons have to deal with. There's some substance to the conflict. So as you think about Hank and Julie, what do you imagine the substance was for them? If you think about Hank's point of view, the substance might have been the project that they were working on, and the need to staff that project with good people, and also the methodology that they used to talk to each other was another thing that Hank was concerned about. For Julie, the problem, the substance of this might be her workload, might be her interest in communicating with him in a way that was effective, and that's why she sent him the email. So the problem is a part of it, but that's where we spend most of our energy and most of our attention, and we try to fix the problem, but we're missing 2 legs of the stool here, and a one-legged stool won't stand, right? So what's the next part? The next part that needs to be resolved are the needs. So the need is really the wants and the desires. It's the underlying issue or the underlying concern that drives why we care about the problem in the first place. So and we're going to spend more time on this in the next section here, but I just will foreshadow by saying, if you think about Hank, what did he need in that situation? Well, he might say, I want people to be direct with me. I want people to be honest. Integrity is important to me. Those are the kind of words I heard from him when I really asked him why he was so furious about the way Julie handled this project and her withdrawal. When I talked to Julie privately, she would say things like, well, I want to be respected as a professional. I'm a manager. I don't have people yelling at me. I don't even feel safe around him anymore. So those are the kind of needs that she was describing and the kind of needs that he was describing. And you find that those things are extremely important. In fact, the iceberg analogy here is quite intentional. The idea is that well, I read this somewhere on the internet, so it must be true. 3% of the iceberg is above the surface, and the other vast majority of it is underneath. And that's how it is with needs. That's really what drives us in conflict. We don't care as much about, an email, a 3-line email. It's what does that 3-line email represent, and what need does that affect in us? So we're going deeper here, and these things are not as obvious as the problem is. The next one is the process. So how the conflict is resolved matters. It matters a great deal. And this is one that doesn't get much attention. We tend to focus on either solving the problems, maybe dealing with the emotional dimension, but we don't think as much about how we solve the problem. So again, if you think about the Hank and Julie situation, you can imagine that for Julie, him pounding on the door, barging into a meeting with her staff, dragging her across the hall to yell at her, was not an effective process for addressing the situation. But how they deal with it from that point forward then becomes important. So how are they going to work through the conflict? What process are they going to use? Are they going to schedule a time that they're both comfortable and are able to talk about it? Are they going to go to their mutual boss and have the mutual boss help them work through the problem? Are they going to do some process that's going to be successful and meaningful for both of them? So we don't give much attention or credence to this idea of process, but it really is the third leg of the stool of good conflict resolution. I've had cases where people have solved the problem, but they still feel lousy about the process and don't feel good about the outcome. An analogy would be my work with people that have actually sued their organizations for discrimination. And I met an attorney once who did about 8 really significant cases of people that were let go of their organization, turned around and sued, and then actually won their cases. And she polled all 8 of these former clients and asked them, if you knew now what you knew, or if you knew then what you know now about the process of going through court and getting your case resolved in that way, would you do it again? And all of them said no. Now, folks, these are the people that won their cases, the ones that actually were successful, who got the headline in the newspaper saying, employee X wins gazillion dollars from company Y. So one could argue that they got the problem fixed, they got their needs met, they were vindicated, but the process was so complicated and obscure and had so many Latin words and confusion that they didn't feel comfortable with it. So the process matters a great deal, and that's a lot of what I do as a mediator, is try to help people have a good process to resolve the conflict, and so that's a very meaningful part. All right, so I emphasize that one in particular because it's not as intuitively obvious to people. So in your conflicts, I'd like you to, going forward, think about these 3 dimensions of the stool or the triangle. Again, you can jot this down in your work materials if you'd like to jot down your the answers. It's the needs, and the fill in the blank here, the needs, the substance, and the process. Now, I'm not belittling or saying that the substance isn't important. You obviously have to deal with the substance of the conflict. So Julie and Hank need to figure out what they're going to do about the project that they were working on together, how they're going to staff that project, and if she's going to withdraw, how she's going to withdraw, and how she's going to do that successfully. So the substance needs to be worked out, but you also have to address the other concerns as well. All right. So I just mentioned the idea of needs, and that we were going to focus more on that in a little bit here, which I'd like to help you consider that as well. As far as our outcomes, the third outcome was to recognize how underlying needs are embedded in every conflict, and to imply this insight to help people move beyond impasse. So let's think about what some of those needs might be. What are the things that are kind of the underlying drivers, the engine that fuels a lot of the issues that we get concerned about in the workplace? As you think about the conflicts in your work life and the ones you've seen around you, what's really at stake for people? As I've drilled down into this topic and helped people address it in different conflicts throughout the last couple of decades, I found that these are some of the common needs that people express as their primary concerns. People need things like respect and control. They want to feel like people are being honest. Safety comes up a lot. The ability for privacy, self-esteem, acceptance. So there's so many different aspects of conflict that are really rooted in these kinds of issues. And again, you see the iceberg analogy here to indicate that there's more underneath it than meets the eye. To help you all consider this from your own experience, think about what this means to us. So let's imagine that there's a conflict about money. It happens probably a million times a day across the country. And people get into deep, heated, strong fights around issues involving money. And I'd like you to imagine that stack of dollar bills or $100 bills and what it really represents. So that's the substance. That's the tangible part, the piece you can feel and touch and taste if you're interested. But you can't. But there's a deeper element to this. And so, as you think about it for yourself, what does money really represent? And I gave you a list of words just a moment ago to imagine, and I'll give you kind of the answers here. There's lots of different things that money represents. So it looked like it was an argument about money. It looked like we were both tugging on the $100 bill back and forth because we wanted a piece of paper. But we really don't just want the piece of paper. What we want and what money represents to us are all of these other concepts, which are much more profound and deep-seated in who we are. If I have money, then maybe that's an indication that I'm competent at what I do. Society values what I do and rewards me with some money. I get freedom from the money that I have. It allows me to choose what I do in my free time and to have some discretionary income. It helps me with my basic needs, helps me feed my family and wife and kids. There's also these other words, control and power, and I want to emphasize for you that those are the positive kinds of control. Like we all want control in our life and in our world. We all want to have some power. So it's not power to do things or to control other people. It's just our own little sphere of influence and our ability to have some of that. So some of that comes through our relationship with money as well. My point in all of this is to say that the $100 bill here is really just a metaphor for every conflict that you've ever been in and will ever be in. It looks like it's about one thing. It looks like it's about the noise from your neighboring cubicle, and it looks like it's the email that you got that was upsetting. It looks like it's about a job duty or job description. It looks like those things at the surface, but underneath it all, there are these core concepts and these key concerns that we have, and we need to address those if we're really going to resolve the conflict. So I mentioned offhandedly before that I'm going to give you the key to resolving all human conflict. Well, this is really it. When I have 5 minutes to explain my work to people, this is what I share with them, this idea that there's an underlying need that's embedded in every conflict that we deal with, and we need to try to find resolution to those. One of the remarkable things about the case with Hank and Julie was that asking them what they both wanted, well, one of the things they both wanted was respect. And when you find out that they both want respect, then that really gives them an opportunity to talk about a shared need. In fact, the needs are positive and they're valued by everybody. So if you think about Julie saying she wants respect, and it turns out that he also wants respect, well, there they have a commonality that they didn't realize they had, and they wouldn't have realized they had if they just stayed on the surface level of, you shouldn't have sent me that email, well, you shouldn't have barged into my office, well, you shouldn't have withdrawn from the project. People can fight about that stuff all day long. But if you start to say, well, what about your underlying concern here, your need for respect or your need for directness or honesty, those are the kind of things that people cannot refute. In fact, I have a slide for you on that one too. So it's easy to say, I don't believe you, or I don't agree with you, or you can't have that, but it's really hard to deny somebody's needs. I work with the worst conflicts that people get into in the workplace, and I have vanishingly rarely had anybody look at the other person across the table and say, I don't care about your need for safety. I don't care about your need for security. I don't care about your need for for comfort or privacy. It just doesn't happen. So on the other hand, I have people all the time saying, oh, well, your way of communicating stinks, or your way of doing this, or you're guilty of that, or the other thing. People do that all the time. So it's easy then for the other person to back that down. But if the person instead starts to talk about their needs, then that becomes a very different conversation. And this is what I'm encouraging you all to do, is to fundamentally shift the conversation to start to talk about your needs. So you figure out what your need is first, and then put it out there, put it on the table. I have an interest in some affirmation about what I'm doing, or that I'm actually adding some value to this team, and I feel like your attack on me is undermining that, or is making it hard for me to get that kind of affirmation. If you start talking about it in those terms, then it's going to be much more difficult for the other person to say something very damaging to you. And the other part of this is for you then to conjecture or to hear what their perspective is, what their underlying need is, and to start to talk about their need as well. So you not only talk about it from your own perspective, but what it is potentially for the other person. And by doing this, by shifting the conversation from that surface level where you're tugging back and forth on the $100 bill, and instead talking about the real underlying drivers and the real needs, that's going to fundamentally change the conversation and lead to the possibility that the needs will be shared by the other person, and that they will at least understand what's really going on for you. I know that tends to make people feel like they're being more vulnerable, but it's also much more powerful than if you just stay at the surface. Which leads to the grand finale here on this point, which is that there are only a couple of ways to deal with the positions. So people might figure out, well, there's only one or two ways. I think of another case I had where a manager was concerned about her employee who was going to her boss and pitching all these great ideas that he had. He actually took the upper management's open door policy seriously and went upstairs with all kinds of ideas. And his manager, felt like she was being bypassed. And when I talked with him about what was going on, from his point of view, he felt like she was a roadblock and was getting in the way and stopping him from being successful, was kind of suppressing him and not allowing him to get his ideas to shine and carry them upstairs on his behalf. And so that was really challenging for these two. By the time I got to this case, somebody was going to be fired. One of the two was going to lose their job. It had gotten that serious. And if you stayed with these folks on their positions, it's kind of binary. There's only a couple of ways for them to work this out. One is that he's going to just stay in his cubicle and stay inside the box that she's trying to paint him into and do what he's told. So that was one option. The other kind of binary option was for him to bypass her and to ignore her and to continue to do this, where he would go to upper management and share his ideas and probably complain about her along the way, which he had clearly been doing. So if they just stayed on those two options, either you're going to not get to go upstairs and talk to the upper folks, or not, that was the choice, then you don't have many options to go. There's only a couple of ways to resolve that, yes or no. But there are many ways to satisfy needs. So as you think about this case, what were his needs? His need was appreciation, was recognition, was the ability to have some influence, to really have what most of us want in our work, is to come to work and have something meaningful and be successful and be recognized for it. And for her, a manager, did she have a legitimate right to try to manage the work of her employee, to try to channel some of his communications with upper management? In other words, did she have the right to control, to have some power in this situation? The answer, of course, is yes on that. So if we started looking at their needs, then you're able to stitch together a very different outcome than the binary one I was describing before. And in that case, in fact, what happened was they developed a multi-point agreement where he would develop a list of his ideas. He would then kind of personally go through them and try to figure out which ones were more important or the effective ones. He prioritized the items that he wanted to take further, and he would work with her to go through that list. She would agree to look over them, and then she would agree to take his ideas to upper management with his fingerprints on them, so that it would be clear that these ideas were his and not something that she was kind of taking from him. And they would do that on a monthly basis. And so as you think about that, he finally got what he wanted. He got some recognition. He got the opportunity to have his input, have some effect on the organization. And what did she get? Well, she, of course, got the control that she needed. She got the ability to help him do his work, but to stay kind of within the guidelines of what was normal for their organization. So that's the power of these needs, and the ability to find those, ferret them out, and change the conversation towards them is very powerful. All right, so that gets us to the third one, about a third outcome for today, which is to recognize underlying needs and how they're embedded in every conflict. And it'll help you get beyond impasse if you start to shift your thinking in that direction. The fourth outcome for today was to name the one essential listening mindset that every successful conflict resolver has. And for this one, it really boils down to one concept, and that is this idea of curiosity. So I'd like to invite you to, after we're done today, you can read the article. It's the last page in your handout, and it's called Why Active Listening Stinks, article I wrote from a newsletter, but that seems to have resonated with folks as I've shared it with them. And it's the idea that if we are just genuinely curious about what the other person is saying, if we're open to hearing what they have to say, if we're just like this pug, basically, and we kind of perk up our ears and twist our head a little bit and really listen to what the other person says, then all the technique and all the active listening skills and all that stuff you already know how to do, it becomes imbued with more meaning. It actually becomes more real. I think we can use a lot of technique-y stuff to show that we're listening, to even pretend at times that we're listening. But folks, I'd be out of a job if people really came into their conflict situations and were genuinely curious about what the other person has to say. It's very powerful, and I have seen many clients that have sat across from the other, and there are those that fail miserably at this. They just don't listen. They only want to get their point across. They want to refute. They want to deny. They want to attack the other side. And those folks are kind of spectacularly unsuccessful in resolving the conflict without a lot of work. But the ones that are successful are the ones that are genuinely curious, that listen to what the other person has to say, that try to understand the other person's point of view before they try to share their own perspective. It's hard to do. It's hard for me to do. Just ask my wife. It's not easy, but it is imperative if you're going to be a good conflict resolver to really just be curious. So I'm not going to give you a bunch of tips on active listening about summarizing and providing feedback or acknowledging feelings or attending to what the other person's saying with your body language. You already know all of that stuff. But this is the one place where I think most people tend to fall down, is the willingness and the ability to turn that switch on. Some of my live trainings ask people to raise their hand in the air, and we look around the room and everybody kind of has their hands up, and then I say, now raise your hands higher. And people can always raise their hands higher. And it's that metaphor that I use for listening. You can listen at that first level, like your hand is just kind of partially up in the air. That's the way we listen most of the time. It's kind of water cooler listening. But the kind of listening that we really need to do when there's conflict in the mix, when conflict is part of the part of the relationship, and we know that this can be a tense, more difficult conversation, well, then we need to just from the start raise our hands all the way up in the air. We need to make the conscious decision that there's tension here, there's a conflict, and I need to really be more vigilant about how I'm going to listen in that situation. So remember, just 2 words: be curious. All right. I'm going to give you a little bit more tips here. Everybody knows the golden rule, right? So just mutter the golden rule in your head for a second. It's do unto others, and you know the rest. So that kind of listening is to draw the bridge, to build the bridge back to listening. Golden listening is to listen until you get it. So golden listening is analogous to that, the golden rule of how you want to be treated. And I find that a lot of people in conflicts tend to listen to the other person until the listener gets it. And that's not really effective in a conflict situation. If you get it, it's not enough, because what do you do once you get it? Well, then you usually formulate an opinion, you get an idea, you think, oh, well, I know what my partner is saying here, my conflict partner is saying this, so here's the solution. And then we jump to solutions. In other words, we just listen long enough to get our perspective, and then we think that the situation can be resolved. But there's a higher level of listening, and it goes beyond the golden rule. So some of you may have heard the platinum rule, a more precious metal than gold. And that is, and listen to the distinction here, do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. So it's about the person, the other, instead of about ourselves. And so this idea in listening in conflict is to listen until the speaker feels heard. And this is a very powerful skill to develop, is the ability to listen not just so that you understand it, but so that the other person understands their own perspective better. I can't tell you how many times in my work I've tried this. I've tried to hear what the other person has to say, and then ask questions that help them dig even deeper into their own understanding of the conflict. And often people will kind of backtrack off of something they've said. If you ask them a question, if you try to explore what they're saying and help them think about it at a deeper level, then they're more likely to even kind of retract something that they've said or have a different perspective just hearing it back from you. So this can be true in our interpersonal conflicts in the workplace with other people, to really listen, to hear what they have to say. It certainly requires curiosity to understand what the other person is saying, but the intent of why we're doing that, well, part of it is so that they can really understand what they're saying, and in doing so, you get more information. And in conflict resolution, kind of information is power, the ability to understand really what the other person is about and what their perspective is very powerful, because it gives you more to work with and you're more successful in resolving the situation. So that's everything I wanted to share with you all about this idea of listening when tension is in the room, when there's conflict in the relationship. You listen at the platinum level and you listen at a curiosity level. And your reward for doing this is that you are creating a contagion effect. If you're really listening to what they're saying, I'm not encouraging you all to become doormats here and just listen ad nauseum to the other person and never get your point across. Think about how we talk about contentious issues even in our society. What do we usually do? Just turn on the news or any debate, right? And you'll see people drawing lines and hurling information and statistics and facts and emotion back and forth across at each other. But how often do we actually listen to the other side? If you employ these two concepts, the idea of platinum listening and curiosity, and you demonstrate that to the other person, when it's your turn to share your perspective, then the other person, the one that wasn't in this training, will say, well, gosh, you're making an okay point here, but here's what I really think. And then they start stepping on you and interrupting you. Well, this is your opportunity to kind of ask for reciprocity. And you can say to people, listen, I think I understood what you said. I recited back your key concepts. You said I understood it. I respectfully listened to what you said. And now I'd like to share my point of view. So you can actually use your good listening as leverage to be more successful in getting your own point across, which is power. And so, again, I'm not encouraging you all just to be to lay down and let the other person describe what they want without you having the same opportunity. So that's what's powerful about it, is it invites reciprocity, the ability to hear both your side and the other person's side. All right. So with that in mind, I'd like to move to our next one. So this is a skill that actually takes that concept of needs and turns it into a more tangible skill. So we have these two guys doing Jujitsu, and the idea of Jujitsu is that you use the other person's energy to kind of knock them off balance. So if somebody's attacking you, like the guy on the left is attacking the guy on the right. So the guy on the right has a couple of options, right? He can start fighting back and swinging his fists and kicking and fighting straight at the other person on the left. He can use his energy to the left guy's energy, and then he can model that and attack him just as ferociously in the other direction. Or the guy on the right can be more like me and basically run away. So those are two options that we tend to think of in a situation like this. But the Jiu-Jitsu option, or Aikido, is quite powerful. It's the person on the right takes the momentum from the person on the left and actually kind of throws that person off balance. And then the person on the left falls down and stumbles and comes back and attacks again. And time after time, the guy on the right will just continually kind of knock the other off balance, only using the attacker's energy. So this is a metaphor for the idea of reframing. So how often do people in conflict, that we're in conflict with or that we see in conflict around us, how often do they talk about what they want, the positive thing that they're looking for? How often do they, from the very beginning, talk about their needs and their wants? Well, very rarely. Instead, it's like a fist flying right at you, right? It's the negative stuff. It's you do this and you do that, and it's accusation, it's blame, it's attack. And so just like our Jiu-Jitsu master up here, the best approach then is not to just fight back with counter insults or counter attack, but to take that energy and to try to shift it off in a more constructive direction. So how do you do that? Well, you recast the negative statement into a more neutral or needs-based statement. I'm going to give you a couple of very specific examples here so you can see what this looks like in practice. Let's take a look at the first one. So imagine, and I've made this one a little easier on you, it's not directed right at you, but it's directed at somebody in your workplace. So Juan is out of control. All he does is spy on me all day. I don't know how he gets any work done. So if you were to hear that statement, what's the counterattack? So say you're the supervisor in the situation, and you know Juan, and you know that Juan is an excellent employee. In fact, Juan was the employee of the year last year. So you might say to this employee who's telling you this about Juan, hey, what do you mean Juan's out of control? That's ridiculous. He was employee of the year last year. He's a stellar employee. He's doing a great job. And I think you need to get a sense of reality here. Well, is that going to be effective? Is the person that said this, are they going to feel satisfied with that? Probably not. So you're challenged then to reframe, to try to figure out what the need is, and then convert to that conversation. Try to shift the conversation to the need. Now, this is a very specific skill. I'm not saying that you don't do all the other things that I was talking about before. You listen well, you're curious, you summarize, you reflect, you reframe, you do these other skills and before you get to this one. But at some point, you try to figure out, what does this person really want? And there's a couple of key words here. If you look at it closely, you'll see control, you'll see spy, and you'll see getting work done. So what are the needs that each of those tends to represent? Let's just take the one on spying, for example. What's the need? If you look back or think about that list that I showed you before around the iceberg, the idea of spy here is maybe about privacy. We all have some legitimate rights for privacy in the workplace and the ability to feel like our work is not being micromanaged every second of the day, and that we have some ability to do independent and autonomous work. So you might, at some point, say to this person, again, after you've done all the good listening and everything else we talked about, but at some point you might say, well, it sounds like your privacy is important to you. And if they say yes, or the opponent that you're having the conflict with says yes, then you can have a conversation about privacy. Okay, so it sounds like you want more privacy in your work. What would that look like? How would you get that? What's Juan doing that's making you feel like you're not getting that? And what could he do that would help you feel like you're getting the privacy that you deserve? The idea of, I don't know how he gets any work done. So there again, what's the underlying need? Is that about effectiveness? Is that about efficiency? Is that about productivity? Whatever it is, you can ask it as a question. If they say yes or no, you can drill down into it and find out what it's really about. So let's say in the end it's about productivity. Well, now you and this person are going to have a conversation about privacy and productivity. And I guarantee you that that is a much more productive and positive conversation than kind of fighting back and forth whether or not one is a spy who's not doing anything. That's just not going to be a productive conversation. But you can imagine that a conversation instead about privacy, about how to create that and craft that for these two folks is going to be much more successful. All right, so let's give you another example. So I'm not going to give you all the answers on this one. I'd like you to consider this one. I'll read it for you and then ask you to kind of ferret out the underlying needs here. I do my part, but other people on the team, including you, aren't pitching in and giving this project the attention it deserves. As you think about that, and you have now this new lens, I hope that you all can think about this as almost a new filter, that you can see negative statements, the fist flying right at you. This time you're in the mix here, right? Including you. So it's coming right at you. You're going to listen, you're going to be curious, find out more about it. But at some point, try to figure out what this person's underlying need is and to shift the conversation over to that. So I would conjecture for you, and some of you might have already come up with this, is, the issue of teamwork is important here. I do my part, but other people don't do what they're supposed to do. So teamwork is important to you, and the magical answer you want to hear when you ask people that kind of thing is, yes, teamwork is important to me. So now you've done it. You've changed the conversation. Instead of having a push-pull argument, you're suddenly having a conversation now about teamwork and how can we enhance the teamwork in our group or in our department. And that's vastly more effective than not doing that. So this brings us to the grand finale. I'd like to ask you all just to reflect on what we've talked about. We covered some territory here. We described the upside of conflict. My hope is that you have a new perspective on conflict and can kind of enter your conflict a little less concerned, at least one notch up from where you started today, that you have that model of the three pillars in your perspective about dealing with conflict, the process and the needs and the substance, that those are all three equally important and need to be resolved, that you have a new appreciation and this new filter in place for looking at the underlying needs within conflict and how that is significant in dealing with conflict situations, and that you have some mindsets for listening more effectively. I believe we have a couple of minutes here for questions.
Yeah, a couple quick moments, I think. First of all, a lot of compliments. That was a great presentation, so thanks again for being here.
Yeah.
One person asked, especially in regards to their supervisor, but when they communicate a need to someone and the response is that need is being met or should be met in this case already, how would you recommend responding from there?
Okay. So I think one of the best responses is to go to basics. And so what's the basic? One of the basic things I encourage you all to do is be curious. So in that situation, I would say if the boss thinks that your need is being met, but you don't think it's being met, your instinct might be to say, well, no, it's not being met. You're not listening to me. You're not a good supervisor. Instead, if you can restrain that part of your mind and your emotional reaction and say instead, well, that's interesting. You feel that I should have had that need met already. Tell me more about that. How do you feel that that's the case, or why do you think my concern isn't legitimate? I really want to know. Tell me more about that. So again, if you can adopt that kind of an attitude, that kind of an approach, then you can start to draw out what their point of view is. But ultimately, remember the contagion effect here. You're listening to him or her, and so now it's at some point your chance to share your perspective, and you'll be more successful doing that if you have really listened to them first. So then you might say at some point, though, I hear you saying that you don't feel that my concern about this is legitimate, but here's why you said that. still, though, this is what's going on for me, and I'd like a chance to explain to you why I feel differently about this. So it gives the person an opportunity to be heard, but it also gives you a chance to share your concerns. Other questions?
Yeah, one more kind of related to needs. You mentioned this was unlikely, but and what would you do in a situation where the person is saying, well, I don't care about your needs?
Ah, yeah. Well, I appreciate you prefacing that by saying that it's something that I rarely run into. So I don't want to overstate that, though. I think I'm not saying that everybody is going to be benign and you're going to be able to magically resolve all your conflicts with this information. It is kind of a baby with the bathwater scenario to some extent. You don't want to throw this out because it's going to work with most people. But there are occasionally people that are going to be hostile to you and aren't going to care about your needs. And I think in those situations, it's going to be helpful for you to try to figure out another strategy to approach those kinds of folks. And so really just shifting back to the substance is sometimes effective in those situations, not trying to resolve the underlying relationship issues, but just deal with the substance. So I remember, well, I won't get into a whole case here, but I had a case that was one where a woman was reacting very strongly to the idea of the needs and was really denying it for the other person. So I just really rolled up my sleeves and said, okay, well, let's just deal with the problem then. What's the problem? The problem is you're seeing it that way, the other person's doing this. Let's work that out. So I think shifting back to that baseline of the substance can be the best way to handle those situations.
That's not for the questions again.
Thank you very much, Chris. We all learned a lot here today, and I'm really glad you came.
Thank you.
One more quick thing. This will be posted. This will be posted up later. So if you have any questions or anything like that, certainly feel free to give us a call at Reliant.